Hello, everybody. I hope this short message finds you doing well. We're continuing our study in the book of James this week, looking at chapter 4. And it's really a chapter unpacking wisdom. James talks at the end of chapter 3 about two types or kinds of wisdom, this true heavenly wisdom and a false earthly wisdom. And in chapter 4, he puts a little more meat on the bones. He fleshes these two ideas out. And so I want to look at chapter 4 with sort of three main ideas or points in mind. The first one is the absence of wisdom. The second is wisdom yields repentance. And the third is the wisdom manifest, or the manifestation of wisdom. And so we start in verses 1 through 3 with the absence of wisdom. In these verses, we're presented really with a picture of foolishness, of being led by worldly desires that yield fighting and death. If this is that earthly kind of wisdom, it's seeing our lives marked by bitter envy and selfish ambition, perhaps getting at his previous words to those who would desire to be leaders and teachers, and also his instructions about being careful with the words that we use and things that we say. From here, he moves into verse 4, which is sort of emphasizes the idea that friendship with the world means enmity against God. James is pointing out the reality that we all have ways that we've made friends with the world. Perhaps for us, that's being consumed by consumerism. Maybe it is an apathy born out of our own comfortable lives, an apathy to the discomfort, the pain and the struggle of others around us, something that is very evident right now. Or maybe it's simply a pride in thinking that our ways are better. This is something that James touches on in chapter 3 again, this idea of teaching and the words that we use and practicing wisdom. And it's something also that comes up in the last part of this chapter, verses 13 through 17, where James sort of lays out this idea of people presuming upon or perhaps ignoring the sovereignty of God, his will and his ways in the world, exalting our own human ways. And so James calls us to repentance. He calls his hearers to repentance that's marked by a washing of their hands, purifying of hearts, grieving, mourning, and wailing, and a humbling of oneself before God. And the good news is that when we acknowledge the ways we've made friends with the world, the ways that perhaps we have ignored or rejected God's ways, and the true wisdom, choosing rather that earthly wisdom and reaping what it sows, fighting, quarreling, division, things that hinder the mission of the church as we all want to do our own thing in our own ways. In the midst of all of that, James gives us the good news that God comes near to those who turn back to him. God brings forgiveness, and he brings renewed life. And for all of those who humble themselves, he says in verse 10, that God will lift them up. Really incredibly good news when we recognize the depth of our sinfulness, but also the depth of God's grace, just as he mentions in verse 6, that he gives us more grace. And so from here, the last part of this idea of these 3 points of wisdom manifest, or the manifestations of wisdom. Because when we recognize our own mortality, this is what James gets at in verse 14. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. When we recognize our mortality and we recognize God's will and his ways and depend on them, it reorients our life, the way we live, our mindset, and the way that we interact with others. And he ends this section in verse 17 that with the idea that when we exercise true wisdom, we seek to do the good that we should do, that we know we should do, rather than pursuing these selfish desires, these worldly ambitions that we might be tempted to pursue. Because ultimately, true wisdom means living foolishly as far as the world's concerned. It means depending on God rather than ourselves, in emphasizing our weakness and humility before God. It means seeking the good of others, perhaps at our own expense, which sort of leads into the last way that this wisdom expresses itself, and this willingness to suffer loss, to see justice and peace accomplished. Two things that our world is really in need of right now, abundantly clear when we watch the news, when we see those around us. And so James' call for us in chapter 4 is to be reminded of these two types of wisdom, the ways that they play out in our lives, and to seek true wisdom through repentance and humility and a recognition of how great the grace of God is for each one of us as we turn and come near to him. Again, I hope this message finds you doing well, and blessings on your week.